August 15, 1945. The air over Japan hung thick with ash and silence. In the rubble-strewn streets of Yokohama, a young woman clutched her daughter's hand, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. The child's ribs pressed against thin cotton. Around them, the remnants of wooden homes smoldered, sending trails of gray smoke into a sky that had known too many fires. The war was over. Emperor Hirohito's voice had crackled over the radio at noon, speaking words no Japanese citizen had ever heard from their living god: surrender. But for the woman and her daughter, and for millions like them across the shattered islands, the announcement brought no relief. It brought only a new kind of terror. They had been told for years what would come if they lost. The propaganda posters plastered on every wall, the radio broadcasts that interrupted even children's programming, the whispered warnings from neighbors who claimed to know, they all painted the same picture. The Americans were demons. Oni. They would burn cities, rape women, bayonet children, desecrate temples, and erase the Japanese race from existence. For 4 years, this message had been drummed into every mind, every heart. And now, those demons were coming ashore. The woman pulled her daughter closer. In her pocket, she carried a small knife. Not for food. Not for protection in any traditional sense. If the soldiers came, if they reached for her child, she knew what she would have to do. Mercy killing. It was a phrase mothers whispered to each other in the dark. Better a swift death by a parent's hand than the horrors the Americans would inflict. Better to die Japanese than to live violated. This was not paranoia born of imagination. This was the calculated result of a militaristic government that had, for years, conditioned its population to see surrender as the ultimate dishonor, occupation as a fate worse than annihilation. The Japanese Imperial Army had distributed instructions to civilians on the home islands: resist the invasion, fight with bamboo spears if necessary, and if capture was inevitable, take your own life. School children had practiced this. Young girls had been taught where to strike with a blade to ensure death came quickly. In Okinawa, just months before, entire families had leapt from cliffs rather than face American capture. In Saipan, the year prior, mothers had thrown their infants into the sea before following them into the waves. These were not aberrations. They were the logical extremes of a propaganda machine that had spent years dehumanizing the enemy and glorifying death over defeat. And so, when the first American troops landed on Japanese soil in late August, they encountered something none of their training had prepared them for: a civilian population paralyzed by existential terror. Not the terror of bombs or bullets, those the Japanese people knew intimately, but the terror of the unknown monster. The Americans expected hostility, perhaps sabotage, maybe scattered resistance from holdout soldiers. What they found instead were empty streets, shuttered homes, and faces pressed against windows, watching with the wide-eyed stillness of prey animals awaiting the predator's strike. Marine Lieutenant Thomas Hartley stepped off the landing craft onto the dock at Yokosuka Naval Base on August 30, 1945. He was 24 years old, a veteran of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and he had seen enough death to fill several lifetimes. He carried his rifle at the ready, expecting ambush, expecting mines, expecting something. But the base, which had once housed thousands of Imperial Navy personnel, was a ghost town. The few Japanese sailors who remained stood in rigid formation, eyes fixed forward, faces drained of color. They looked, Hartley would later write in his diary, like men waiting for execution. The Americans moved inland cautiously. Intelligence had predicted widespread guerrilla warfare, civilian uprisings, even mass suicide attacks. Instead, they found villages where people fled at their approach, houses where families barricaded themselves inside, and towns where shopkeepers closed their doors and hid their daughters in cellars. In Yokosuka, a translator approached a group of civilians who had been corralled for processing. An elderly man fell to his knees, trembling, and began to apologize in broken English for crimes he had not committed. A young mother covered her children's eyes. A teenage girl fainted. This was the legacy of empire. This was what years of militaristic indoctrination had wrought, a population so thoroughly terrorized by their own government's lies that they could not conceive of an occupier who might show restraint, let alone compassion. But here, in the ashes of total war, something unprecedented in human history was about to unfold. The Americans who landed in Japan in the late summer and fall of 1945 were not a conquering horde. They were, for the most part, young men who wanted nothing more than to go home. They had fought their way across the Pacific, island by island, through some of the most brutal combat the world had ever seen. They had lost friends, witnessed atrocities, and hardened themselves to survive. But they were also products of a society fundamentally different from the one they now occupied. They came from a nation where abundance, even in wartime, was the norm, where civilians had never known occupation, where the concept of total war on home soil was abstract. And crucially, they came under orders from a supreme commander who understood that the peace would be won not with the sword, but with the rice bowl. General Douglas MacArthur had assumed control of occupied Japan on August 30th, landing at Atsugi Air Base with a corncob pipe clenched between his teeth and a vision for reconstruction that would reshape not just Japan, but the entire post-war order. MacArthur was many things: egotistical, theatrical, brilliant, and often infuriating. But he understood power in ways that transcended military force. He knew that to truly defeat Japan, America needed to do more than destroy its armies. It needed to destroy the lie that had sustained those armies, the lie that militarism and emperor worship were the only paths to greatness, and that the Western powers were barbaric colonizers intent on subjugation. Within days of the surrender, MacArthur issued a directive that shocked even his own staff: feed the Japanese. Not just the prisoners of war, not just the collaborators, but the entire civilian population. Japan was starving. The naval blockade had choked off imports for months. The strategic bombing campaign had destroyed not just factories but railways, warehouses, and farmland. The rice harvest of 1945 was projected to be catastrophic. Millions faced starvation. And MacArthur, representing the nation that had just dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities, declared that American resources would be used to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. The decision was not universally popular. In Washington, budget hawks balked at the cost. In Australia and the Philippines, where Japanese occupation had been synonymous with brutality and famine, there was bitter resentment at the idea of feeding the former enemy while their own people still struggled. Some American servicemen, who had buried friends killed by Japanese soldiers, questioned why they should now hand out rations to those same soldiers' families. But MacArthur was adamant. Starvation, he argued, would breed chaos, and chaos would breed communism. The Soviet Union was already eyeing Hokkaido. China was descending into civil war. If Japan collapsed into famine and disorder, the entire Pacific would be lost to the Reds. More than that, MacArthur saw an opportunity. By feeding Japan, America could demonstrate in the most visceral way imaginable the superiority of democratic capitalism over militaristic authoritarianism. It could turn enemies into allies through the simple, undeniable power of a full stomach. And so, in September 1945, the first shipments of American rice, wheat, and canned goods began to arrive in Japanese ports. Private First Class Daniel O'Connor was part of the 1st Cavalry Division assigned to occupation duty in Saitama Prefecture, north of Tokyo. On September 12th, his unit was ordered to establish a distribution point in the town of Kawagoe. The town had been heavily damaged by firebombing in April, and most of its population was surviving on wild grasses and whatever could be scavenged from the ruins. O'Connor, a farm kid from Iowa, had never seen anything like it. In his letters home, he described children with swollen bellies, women who looked like walking skeletons dressed in rags, and old men who bowed so deeply their foreheads touched the ground when the Americans passed. The unit set up tables in the town square. Sacks of rice, crates of canned beef, boxes of powdered milk, all stamped with U.S. Army insignia. The sight of so much food in one place was almost obscene against the backdrop of hunger. O'Connor and his fellow soldiers waited. They had been briefed to expect chaos, maybe even violence. Instead, for nearly an hour, no one came. The Japanese civilians watched from a distance. Whispers passed through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Was it a trap? Would they be shot if they approached? Was the food poisoned? The propaganda they had consumed for years was a lens through which they interpreted every American action. Kindness was inconceivable. Therefore, it must be a trick. Finally, a local policeman, one of the few officials who had not fled, approached the translator. A conversation followed. The translator explained that the food was free, that it was for everyone, that there were no conditions. The policeman looked skeptical. The translator repeated himself. O'Connor, watching this exchange, felt a strange dissonance. He had expected to be occupying a hostile nation. Instead, he was trying to convince starving people to accept food. The policeman returned to the crowd. Another whispered conference. Then, slowly, a woman stepped forward. She was perhaps 30, dressed in a patched kimono, her hair pinned back with a sliver of bamboo. She held a wooden bowl in both hands and approached the table as one might approach a bomb. O'Connor smiled. She flinched. He gestured to the rice. She did not move. So, O'Connor took a scoop of rice and poured it into her bowl. She stared at it, then at him, then back at the rice. Her eyes filled with tears. She bowed, a deep, formal bow that seemed to fold her entire body in half, and then she turned and fled. Within minutes, the square was filled with people. They came in waves, the old and the young, the injured and the sick, mothers carrying infants, children clutching their siblings' hands. They formed a line without being asked, organized themselves with the quiet discipline that would characterize so much of the occupation. And as they passed through the distribution point, each receiving their ration of rice or wheat or canned goods, something began to shift. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But perceptibly. O'Connor noticed it first in the way people stopped bowing so frantically. Then in the way mothers, instead of shielding their children, began to let them stand beside them. Then in the way an old man paused, looked O'Connor in the eye, and said in halting English, "Thank you." This scene replayed itself across Japan in the autumn of 1945. In Tokyo, in Osaka, in Hiroshima's radioactive ruins, in the farmlands of Kyushu, in the fishing villages of Hokkaido. American soldiers handed out food, and Japanese civilians, raised to believe that Americans were monsters, confronted the cognitive dissonance of kindness from the conqueror. It was not a smooth process. There were misunderstandings, language barriers, cultural clashes. Some Japanese remained deeply suspicious. Some Americans remained contemptuous. But slowly, persistently, the narrative began to crack. Sergeant William Nakamura was part of the Military Intelligence Service, a Japanese-American translator who had spent the war years fighting for a country that had imprisoned his parents in an internment camp. He was assigned to Hiroshima in October 1945, where the devastation was so complete that it seemed biblical. In his reports, Nakamura documented not just the physical destruction but the psychological state of survivors. He described meeting a woman who had lost her husband, her 3 children, and her home to the atomic blast. She was living in a lean-to made of scorched wood, surviving on seaweed. When Nakamura's unit arrived with food supplies, she refused to take anything. She believed, she told him, that accepting food from the Americans would dishonor the dead. Nakamura understood. He knew the power of shame in Japanese culture, the weight of obligation, the fear of moral contamination. He did not argue with her. Instead, he left a sack of rice by her shelter and walked away. The next day, it was gone. The day after that, she was in line at the distribution point. This pattern repeated itself. Resistance, suspicion, shame, and then, gradually, acceptance. Not because the Japanese people forgave America for the bombings, for the firebombing, for the years of war. Forgiveness would take decades, and for some, it would never come. But because hunger is a more immediate master than pride, and because in the act of feeding, the Americans were doing something the imperial government had utterly failed to do. They were treating Japanese civilians as human beings worth keeping alive. The symbolism of rice cannot be overstated. Rice was not just food in Japan. It was culture, identity, spirituality. The Japanese word for cooked rice, gohan, is the same word used for meal. To eat rice was to be Japanese. During the war, as supplies dwindled, the government had pushed alternative grains, millet, barley, sweet potato, but rice remained the standard, the ideal, the substance around which society revolved. And now, in the aftermath of total defeat, it was Americans who were providing it. The rice came from California. From the Sacramento Valley, where Japanese-American farmers, many of whom had been interned during the war, grew some of the finest short-grain rice in the world. It was a historical irony so sharp it could cut. Rice grown by the families of men like Sergeant Nakamura, confiscated by the U.S. government, now being distributed in Japan to feed the population that had been at war with them. Some of the rice sacks bore labels from farms whose owners were still in camps. The circularity of it, the strange justice and injustice intertwined, was lost on no one who knew the full story. By November 1945, American food aid was reaching over 10 million Japanese civilians. The logistics were staggering. The U.S. military had to requisition merchant ships, establish supply chains through bombed-out ports, coordinate with local officials who ranged from cooperative to obstructive, and do all of this while still maintaining occupation security and processing the demobilization of millions of Japanese soldiers. It was, by any measure, one of the largest humanitarian operations in history. And it was happening not in a friendly nation, not in an allied territory, but in the heart of what had been, just months before, the most fanatically anti-American society on earth. The impact was profound. In purely practical terms, the food aid prevented mass starvation. Post-war studies estimated that without American intervention, Japan would have faced a famine killing between 1 and 3 million people in the winter of 1945 to 46. The rice harvests of 1945 and 1946 were among the worst in Japanese history, compounded by the breakdown of distribution networks, the loss of Korea and Taiwan as colonial grain sources, and the return of millions of soldiers and civilians from the collapsing empire. Without the influx of American and Allied food, the death toll from hunger would have dwarfed the casualties from the atomic bombs. But the impact went beyond calories. It reshaped the psychological landscape of occupation in ways that are still reverberating today. In the town of Ueda, in Nagano Prefecture, a schoolteacher named Yoshiko Tanaka kept a diary throughout the occupation. Her entries from September and October 1945 are a window into the transformation. On September 3rd, she wrote, "The Americans have arrived. We have hidden the children in the mountains. I do not know if we will see them again. I pray for courage." On September 18th, the Americans gave us rice today. I do not understand. The rice is good. Better than what we had before the war. On October 7th, the children came down from the mountains. An American soldier gave them chocolate. They ate it. I wanted to stop them, but I did not. They smiled. I have not seen them smile in so long. Chocolate. That small, sweet symbol of American abundance became, alongside rice, a vector for cultural transformation. American GIs in Europe had already discovered the power of chocolate as a tool for winning hearts and minds. The Hershey bar, the Tootsie Roll, the chewing gum, these were more than candy. They were tangible proof that America was a land of plenty, where even soldiers carried luxuries. In Japan, where sugar had been rationed since 1940 and chocolate was a distant memory for most civilians, the sight of American soldiers casually handing out sweets to children was revelatory. It must be noted that this generosity was not universal, nor was it purely altruistic. Some American soldiers were cruel. Some were racist. Some took advantage of desperate women, contributing to the growth of a comfort industry that operated with tacit military approval in the early months of occupation. The occupation was, like all military occupations, marked by violence, exploitation, and abuse. These truths coexisted with the rice distribution, with the chocolate bars, with the genuine acts of kindness. History is not clean. But what made the American occupation of Japan different from, say, the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe or the Japanese occupation of Manchuria was a matter of scale and policy. The abuses were real but not systematic. The kindness was not universal but was official policy from the top down. MacArthur's vision was not humanitarian in the abstract. It was strategic. He believed that by demonstrating American material and moral superiority, he could win the peace in a way that military force never could. And in this, the food aid was central. It was a daily, visceral reminder that the Americans were not the demons of propaganda. They were, instead, the providers. They were the ones who came with full hands rather than empty promises. This strategy worked in part because of what the Japanese had experienced under their own government. The wartime regime had demanded total sacrifice. It had hoarded resources for the military while civilians starved. It had promised victory and delivered annihilation. It had told its people that death was preferable to surrender, and then it had surrendered anyway, leaving millions in a moral and existential void. Into this void came the Americans, with rice. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One government had told its people to die for the nation. The other was telling them to eat, to live, to rebuild. One government had treated its civilians as expendable resources in service of the state. The other was treating them as individuals with inherent worth. This was not how the Japanese had been taught to think about America. This was not how they had been taught to think about anything. By the winter of 1945–46, the whispers had changed. In the neighborhoods of Tokyo, in the villages of Tohoku, in the ruins of Nagasaki, people spoke in low voices about the Americans. Not with fear now, but with something more complicated. Confusion. Gratitude. Curiosity. The propaganda had been so absolute, so totalizing, that its collapse left a vacuum. What replaced it was not immediate love for America, that would be absurd, but a willingness to reconsider, to observe, to question what they had been told. This psychological shift was precisely what MacArthur had gambled on. And as the occupation deepened, as the reforms began, land redistribution, women's suffrage, constitutional democracy, the dismantling of the zaibatsu monopolies, the purge of militarist leaders, the foundation laid by rice and chocolate proved essential. People who might have resisted democratization as foreign imposition were more willing to give it a chance because the foreigners imposing it had first kept them alive. There is a photograph, taken in March 1946 in the city of Sendai, that captures this moment. It shows a line of Japanese civilians waiting at a food distribution point. In the foreground, an American soldier is handing a sack of rice to an old woman. She is bowing. He is smiling. Behind them, a group of children watch, and one of them, a boy of perhaps 7, is waving at the camera. He is thin, His clothes are patched, but he is waving. That gesture, small and spontaneous, is a kind of surrender that no military campaign could have achieved. It is the surrender of fear to hope. The rice distributions continued through 1946 and into 1947. As Japan's agricultural sector slowly recovered, the need diminished, but the memory remained. An entire generation of Japanese grew up with the knowledge that in their darkest hour, it was America that fed them. This was not propaganda, though it certainly served propagandistic ends. It was lived experience. It was the taste of California rice on their tongues, the weight of a sack of flour in their arms, the sight of their children eating American canned peaches and smiling. This generosity was not without its critics. In the United States, the cost of feeding Japan became a political football. Isolationists and fiscal conservatives argued that American taxpayers should not be subsidizing former enemies. The counterargument, articulated most forcefully by MacArthur and by President Truman, was that the alternative, a starving, chaotic Japan vulnerable to communist infiltration, would cost far more in the long run. The food aid was, in this view, not charity but investment. An investment in stability, in democracy, in a future where Japan would be an ally rather than a threat. History has largely vindicated that investment. Japan's post-war recovery, its transformation into a peaceful, prosperous democracy, is one of the most remarkable political transformations of the 20th century. And while that transformation had many causes, the skill of Japanese reformers, the dedication of American advisers, the geopolitical incentives of the Cold War, the cultural adaptability of the Japanese people, the foundation was laid in those first months of occupation, when American soldiers handed out rice and Japanese civilians learned that the demons of propaganda were, in fact, just men. There is a Zen saying, "Ichi-go ichi-e," one time, one meeting. The idea that each encounter is unique and irreplaceable, and therefore should be treasured. In the autumn of 1945, millions of unique encounters took place between American soldiers and Japanese civilians. Most were mundane. A transaction, a nod, a handful of rice. But cumulatively, they rewrote the narrative of what was possible between former enemies. Sergeant Nakamura, the translator who had worked in Hiroshima, returned to the city 30 years later. He was retired, a grandfather, and he wanted to see what had become of the place where he had spent those difficult months. Hiroshima had been rebuilt into a modern city, prosperous and vibrant. The Peace Memorial stood where the bomb had detonated, a skeletal dome preserved as a reminder. Nakamura visited it and stood in silence. Afterward, he went to a small restaurant near the memorial. The owner was an old woman, bent with age. She served him tea and rice. As he ate, she asked if he was American. He said yes. She nodded and told him that she had been in Hiroshima in 1945, that she had survived the bomb, that she had wanted to die afterward but had not had the courage. Then the Americans came, she said, and they gave her rice. She did not understand why, but she took it, and she ate it, and she lived. That rice saved my life, she told Nakamura. And I have spent every day since trying to understand why you gave it to me. Nakamura told her that he had been there, that he had been one of the ones handing out food. She stared at him for a long moment, and then she bowed deeply. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for letting me live." This, in the end, is what the rice symbolized. Not conquest, not revenge, but the radical, almost incomprehensible notion that even in total war, even after atomic fire, it is possible to choose mercy. That the victors can feed the vanquished not out of weakness, but out of a strength so secure it does not need to humiliate. That the instruments of war can be set aside and replaced with the instruments of life. The Japanese civilians who whispered in fear in August 1945 had been taught that strength meant brutality, that power meant domination, that the strong devoured the weak. They had been told this by their own government, and they had seen it enacted across Asia by their own armies. And then they were defeated utterly and completely by a nation that had the power to starve them, to subjugate them, to erase them, and instead chose to feed them. That choice reverberated. It echoed through the decades, shaping not just Japan but the entire architecture of the post-war order. It established a template, imperfect and often ignored, but real nonetheless, for what victors could do with their power. It demonstrated that democracy and capitalism were not just ideologies but systems that could produce abundance and share it. And it proved that propaganda, no matter how pervasive, could be undone by something as simple as a bowl of rice offered without conditions. In the rubble of Yokohama, the woman who had clutched her daughter's hand in August 1945 lived to see her daughter graduate from university, marry, have children of her own. She kept the small knife in a drawer, wrapped in cloth, as a reminder of what she had been prepared to do. But she never needed to use it, because the demons never came. Instead, soldiers came with rice. And in that rice, delivered by the hands of former enemies, was the seed of a different future. A future where fear gave way to hope, where hatred gave way to pragmatism, and where two nations, locked in the most brutal of wars, found a way to share a meal and begin again. This is the power of the full rice bowl. Not just to fill the stomach, but to fill the space where propaganda once lived with the undeniable evidence of human decency. It does not erase the past. It does not undo the horrors of war. But it offers something perhaps more valuable: the possibility that even from total destruction, something resembling trust can be rebuilt, one grain at a time.